Step 1 is communication. Make sure that you're contacting the family. In my district, we have a scheduler that contacts the families and they make sure to get 3 or more contact attempts with the family. Usually this is in a letter form and more than one phone call or a phone call and an email. Make sure if a parent is contacting you that you're documenting it in the system that your district requires that you do. We have a digital way of doing this where we document all the contact attempts with the family. Also, to go with this, it would also be nice, in some situations I've sent home forms for families to fill out about their students' strengths as well as their students' concerns that I can use later in my IEP. Also in step 1, under the branch of communication, we have communicating with family, general education staff, and special education staff. Communication is so important to holding a successful IEP meeting, and there's many different people you need to communicate with. You need to make sure you're communicating with the right staff that need to be coming to the IEP meeting and making sure they're available, that you have the appropriate staff members that need to attend. You need to communicate with family and see if there are things that need to be addressed before the IEP meeting. That way you can lessen the time that you're discussing those things during the meeting when you have to go through all the paperwork. It's important that you're communicating with the general education staff. I'll always get a little feedback from the teachers in an email that I can put into the IEP in the general education section of the IEP. And I ask in those emails that teachers send me an example of the student's strengths as well as their weaknesses, and I'll paste that into the IEP. I also try to meet with teachers face-to-face when needed to go over how that student is being successful and where are their weaknesses in the general education settings, so I can reflect that in their IEP as well. You might talk to a teacher and they might say the student's doing fantastic in general education math, even though they're seen on an IEP and pulled out for math, and they might ask that you lessen the amount of time because they're being so successful in that setting. So it's so important that you're collaborating, and it's important that you can get as much of that done before the meeting as possible and discuss what you think might work with the teacher. It's also important that you talk to other special education staff members that work with that student. This could be an occupational therapist or a speech and language pathologist. And it's important that you talk to them about their sections in the IEP, how their language could be impacting their performance in reading, for example, and talk about what accommodations and supports you guys can work on together. It's also important that you communicate with all the staff members that have a part of the IEP that needs to be completed. Step 2 is data collection. I gave this its own step because it's so important that you're collecting data always when you're working with students with IEPs. The samples I'm giving for data are very academic based, I would say. They're not behaviorally related data that I'm putting samples in this PowerPoint of. I have a writing sample and a math sample that I'll show in a minute, but you want to make sure you're using whatever data collection your district wants you using. In my district, I have a lot of freedom in this area. The district isn't providing us with any assessments we should be using for data collection, so I get a lot of freedom. I choose to use the Words Their Way spelling assessments. They're very inexpensive to find online and use yourself for data collection. I find them very helpful. You want to make sure that you're monitoring the progress of the existing goals and updating that in the IEP. So you want to say the student's currently able to do this on their goal, they have mastered or have not mastered that goal. You want to collect baseline data for the new goal, and I also put in a lot of data that's just giving an overall branch of where the student's at. So I might say they can name 4 out of 5 of the given shapes, even if they aren't going to have a goal for shapes. That's kind of going over some of their strengths. They're able to do these shapes. They're able to count to 100. They're able to identify all numerals from 1 to 1,000. Whatever they're able to do, I put in information of what they can do and then what their weaknesses are. If I list 5 weaknesses in the area of math, that's going to give a lot of examples to the teacher that's going to be receiving the student, as well as to the family of where this student is at. For this, I've created a sample student that I'm going to show work samples of, and this is going to help guide us through the process of having a real example to go with what I'm explaining throughout this process. This is one data sample I collected for spelling using the Words Their Way Primary Spelling Inventory Feature Guide. I used the primary level of words and assessed the students on those words, and for this assessment the student finished writing 14 words. I love this assessment because it not only gives you a score of what words they spelled correctly, the student spelled 5 out of 26 or 5 out of 14 of the total attempted words. You're supposed to stop this assessment once they have 5 continual scores of 0. It looks like I kept on going a little ways with this student. And it lets you look at what their strengths are as well as their weaknesses. The student, I gave him 7 out of 7 for the initial consonants, 7 out of 7 for the final consonants. He knew 5 out of 7 of the assessed short vowel patterns. He was able to do 2 out of 2 of the given digraphs, 3 out of 5 given blends, and the area I decided to focus on was long vowel patterns, and he was assessed on 7 long vowel patterns and only knew 2. So I'm going to use that later when deciding to write a new goal for him, as well as look at where he's at for his current goal. Data sample number 2 is a math sample, and on this you can see the student was given 5 single-digit addition problems with sums to 20, and he was able to solve 2 out of 5. So I'm going to use this as an example when I continue to explain this sample student that I'm going to have for. Step 3 is IEP writing. For this section, I will go over goal writing as well as goal examples and accommodations. There are many other parts that go into the IEP, but this is the main point I'm going to touch on when holding an IEP meeting. The broad picture of this course is to go over how to hold a successful IEP meeting, not every little thing that goes in the IEP. So I'm just briefly going over this because I do think it's extremely important that you look at the goals, and that's really important to holding a successful IEP meeting as well as the accommodations. So for goal writing, you want to establish if any of the existing goals have been mastered. This would not apply in an initial IEP meeting. For most initial IEP meetings, you're getting fresh information from an evaluation that's really going to guide your goals. Most of the time, when doing an annual review of the IEP that's done every year, a lot of those things in the evaluation are kind of old and outdated for the most part. So you need to establish if any existing goals were mastered, and then you also want to establish if you want to keep those goals. I've often had times that the goal wasn't appropriate that was established a year ago and they haven't mastered the goal, but it needs to be expanded. For example, I write lots of goals that our student will write a 5-sentence paragraph with 6 or less errors in spelling and capitalization, because that's something that student needs to work on, and that can easily be measured. But maybe the student's moving into 6th grade and I know they're capable of writing 3 paragraphs. So I will state that even though they weren't able to write 1 paragraph with 6 or less errors in spelling and capitalization, their content is capable of expanding their goal to do 3 paragraphs, and maybe their goal would be that they will do a final draft of 3-paragraph essay all on topic with less than 10 errors in spelling, capitalization, and punctuation. So it's really based on the student's need. You don't want to keep them bogged down by a little goal even if they haven't mastered it. But that needs to be established as an IEP team decision. So I will put that in my notes of my IEP. That's kind of a question to bring up to the team, and we'll decide if we think that's appropriate, and if it is, I'll write in the IEP after the meeting. I'll write in the IEP team was in agreement to revise this goal. Make sure the goals that you're writing are based on the baseline data that you collected. For example, in my sample student, they had baseline data that showed me they only knew 2 out of 7 of the given long vowel patterns. I could easily write a goal that they could write 4 out of 5 of the given words with the bossy E pattern or the long A pattern. Or I could do all long vowel patterns that end in E. For example, like cake, rake, those all are long A patterns. So I could use that to do the goal. I also had one that the student could only do, I think it was 2 out of 5 single-digit addition problems. Their goal could now be Based on that baseline data, they can now solve 4 out of 5 of the given single-digit addition problems with sums to 20 on 3 consecutive samples. And then my data collection will be done once every 2 weeks, and I would establish that in writing my goal. And that lines up with this information I have in red right down here. Goals must be measurable. I know in school teachers would say it needs to pass the dead man's test. It needs to be specifically measurable. There needs to be an assessment, a way of collecting the data. One thing that we talk about a lot in the district I work in is make sure you do not write goals aligned to certain assessments that are only available in your district. For example, in my district, we use a STAR reading assessment and we use a DRA assessment. I would never write a goal aligned to one of those assessments, because if my student leaves my district, my building, or my state, those assessments may not be available, and it's very hard for a teacher to then see where the student is even at with an assessment they have no experience with. So though you can use that assessment to measure it, do not write the goal to say on a certain assessment, for example, a DRA or a STAR assessment. You want it to be broad enough. For example, the math goal I gave, when given 5 single-digit addition problems, the student will solve 2 out of 5. It's not saying on this specific test. It's saying when given those problems, any teacher anywhere can give the student single-digit addition problems with sums to 20. This is a goal example I generated from the data that we got from the students for his math samples. So he was able to solve 2 out of 5 of the given single-digit addition problems. And this is a goal that in 1 year from now, he would solve 4 out of 5 of the given problems correct on 3 consecutive occasions as measured by monthly data collection. So on 3 consecutive math samples or data collection periods, he would be getting 4 out of 5 or more of the given problems correct. Step 3 of the IEP writing is the accommodations. This I call the toolbox. It's very hard for a lot of general education staff members and parents in a lot of cases to be comfortable with their students using accommodations. It's very strange because it's hard for families to realize that their students need help with maybe things they never needed as a child, and it's hard for teachers to let one student have a tool to help them when others can't. So I like to explain it as a tool. For example, I wear glasses. I would never be told I couldn't wear my glasses when taking a test. It's a tool I need to help myself to level the playing field, because in a way, my sight isn't the same as others. So many accommodations that are provided, it's going to be helpful in an IEP meeting that you can explain to the entire team, this is a tool that's going to help this student. For example, many students I will make sure that they can have a graphic organizer provided for them. Students with needing other types of support may need visuals to help support them, like a visual schedule. This isn't making it so that they have something that another student doesn't have, and it's making it so they have a tool that can help them be successful wherever they go in the school. Some students need a multiplication chart. Why not give a student access to a multiplication chart when they're in 5th grade if they could solve a more complex math problem with that tool to help them? So it's a scaffold that you're providing for the student, and you're going to have a more successful IEP meeting if you can explain that to the entire team. Some parents don't want their students to have small group testing. Why are they going to another room? Well, I explained to them in the other room, I'll be in there with them in a quieter setting. They're more comfortable to ask questions. They can advocate for themselves in a setting where they're not going to hear their peers. Their peers aren't going to hear them ask those questions. So it's very important that you explain to the entire team, if needed, why these accommodations are so appropriate for them. Step 3 is writing the IEP again. Make sure that you send home paperwork if needed or required by your district. My district does not require that we send home paperwork in advance before the IEP meeting, but I still send it when needed. I have had certain cases with families where your meeting's going to go by smoother and take less time if you send home the paperwork ahead of time for them to review. And fill out other sections of the IEP. Remember, there isn't just the accommodations and the goals that need to be completed. There's other sections of the IEP, and you want to make sure all of those are completed before the IEP meeting. The only section that should never be completed before the IEP meeting, no matter what, is the prior written notice. The prior written notice is to document any things that were discussed or considered and rejected within that IEP meeting. So before the IEP meeting, that piece of paperwork should never be complete. And are you ready now? Are you ready to hold the IEP meeting? This is the end of the before the IEP meeting section of this presentation.